Hello, this is Julio Green, and today we're going to be talking about society, culture, and reform. We're going to start off with African Americans and revivalism. One of the most dramatic consequences of the revivals was the conversion of hundreds of thousands of enslaved African Americans to Christianity. During the 17th century, many slaveholders feared that baptized slaves would have to be set free. By the second quarter of the 18th century, a growing number of slave owners concluded that Christianity would make slaves more conscientious. It would place them under the obligations to perform their duties with the greatest diligences and fidelity from a sense of duty to God. The first concerted campaigns to convert slaves to Christianity were led by Quaker, Moravian, and Anglican ministers and missionaries during the early 18th century. But it would not be until the late 18th century when Methodists and Baptists licensed African Americans to exhort and preach that truly significant numbers of slaves converted to Christianity. Most slaves attended churches alongside with whites, although a small number of separate black churches, mainly Baptist, began to emerge as early as the 1760s. Within the Baptist and Methodist churches, slaves created a hybrid form of Christianity, blending Christian rituals and beliefs with elements of West and Central African cultures. The result was a religion with its distinctive forms of preaching and worship. This African heritage gave many slaves a hopeful, optimistic view of life, which contrasts sharply with the evangelical stress on human sinfulness. In evangelical religion, many slaves found a stress on love and spiritual equality that strengthened their faith in eventual deliverances from bondage. Spirituals such as Go Down Moses, with its refrain, "Let my people go," indicate that slaves identified with the Hebrew people who had overcome oppression and enslavement. In the next section, we're going to be talking about the Mormons. The Mormon Church had its beginnings in western New York, which was a hotbed of religious fervor. Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterians, and Universalist preachers eagerly sought converts. 14-year-old Joseph Smith Jr., the son of a migrant farmer, listened closely to the preachers but was uncertain which way to turn. In the spring of 1820, Smith went into the woods near Palmyra, New York, to seek divine guidance. Suddenly, he was seized upon by some power that entirely overcame him. A brilliant light revealed two persons who told him that the existing churches were false and that the true Church of God was about to be reestablished on earth. 3 years later, he underwent another supernatural experience. A spectral visitor told him of the existence of a set buried gold plates that contained a lost section from the Bible. Smith proceeded to unearth the golden plates. He was forbidden to reveal their existence for 4 years. When he translated them into English, published the Book of Mormon, and founded the church that would later be known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. His movement quickly grew. Part of Mormonism attraction many be that it spoke to the beliefs of yearnings of antebellum rural New Yorkers. Because Smith said that he had conversed with angels and received direct revelations from the Lord, local authorities threatened to indict him for blasphemy. He and his followers responded by moving to Kirtland, Ohio near Cleveland, where they built their first temple. It was in Kirtland that Mormons first experimented with an economy planned and run by the church. In this community, church trustees controlled the members' property and put members to work building a temple and other structures. Beginning in 1832, pro-slavery mobs attacked the Mormons, accusing them of inciting slave insurrections. They burned several Mormon settlements and seized Mormon farms and houses. 15,000 Mormons fled Missouri to Illinois after the governor proclaimed them enemies. Trouble arose again in Illinois after dissident Mormons published a newspaper denouncing the practice of polygamy and attacking Smith for trying to become king or lawgiver to the church. Today, it is hard to believe that the Mormons should have ever been regarded as subversive, since they are known for their abstinences from tobacco and alcohol, their stress on family and community, and responsibility. Anti-Mormonism was partly rooted in a struggle for economic and political power. Individualistic frontier settlers feared the Mormons, who voted as a bloc and whose trustees controlled their land. Mormons were also denounced as a threat to fundamental social views. Protestant ministers attacked the Mormons for rejecting the legitimacy of established churches, insisting that the Book of Mormon was holy scripture equal in importance of the Bible. The Mormons were also accused of corrupt moral values, especially after 1842, when rumors about polygamy began to spread. Indeed, Mormons did practice polygamy for half a century, which was justified theologically as an effort to reestablish the patriarchal Old Testament family polygamy. Polygamy also served as an important social function, absorbing single or widowed women into Mormon communities. Today, the Mormon Church is one of the fastest growing religious groups in the United States, and its members are known for their piety, industrious sobriety, and thrift. A century ago, anti-Mormons regarded the church as a fundamental threat to American values. Early 19th century American society attached enormous importance to individualism, monogamous marriage, and private ownership of property, and the Mormons were believed to subvert these values. But if in certain respects the Mormons challenged the values of pre-Civil War America, their aspirations were truly the product of their time. They sought nothing less than the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. The next section is Baptists and Methodists. Francis Asbury, 1745 to 1816, a tireless itinerant and America's first Methodist bishop, was one of these religious entrepreneurs, traveling thousands of miles on horseback each year, bringing Methodist institutions like the class meeting and its distinctive connectionalism to the American countryside. Methodism relied on a dedicated and involved laity for its growth and provided just enough satirical leadership for the laity to flourish. Under Asbury's leadership, American Methodism came to feature a highly centralized episcopal polity with a remarkably flexible institutional culture. Hence, its early expansion occurred with relatively few growing pains. By 1830, it would be the largest denomination in the country. And that's it.
Thanks, Folio Green. I'm Casey Green, and now we're moving on to the temperance movement of the 1800s. The appetite for alcohol was growing quickly because farmers grew too much grain, and they couldn't sell it off. Drinking became a social pastime on isolated farms. Some of the biggest advocates for the temperance movement were women, because their husbands would spend all their hard-earned money on alcohol instead of the basic necessities, and they would oftentimes become abusive towards their wives and children. The average male in the 1830s drank 3 times as much as the average male today. By the 1830s, 6,000 local temperance groups were up and running, including the American Society for the Promotion of Temperance in 1826, which used many techniques to promote abstinence. The Washington Temperance Society, formed by 6 reformed alcoholics, provided a safe haven for people to confess their past sins. This movement harbored split views, including people who sought abstinence for all forms of alcohol, including beer and wine. They even took it to state legislation to restrict alcohol sales and consumption, being successful in Maine in June of 1851. On the other side of the spectrum, some people believe that temperance should just rely on the consciousness of the individual. No matter what the view, the temperance movement advocated for one major consequence: a more disciplined society. Now, moving on to the prison and asylum reform of the 1800s, led by the one and only Dorothy Dix. This movement sought for the separation of criminals based on offense, improved prison conditions, and separate institutions for the mentally ill. In 1841, Dorothy Dix agreed to teach Sunday school in a Cambridge prison, and she was appalled by what she saw. Housed together were violent criminals, the mentally ill, women and children, some of whom only committed small offenses, such as spitting in the street or owing $20. Dix toured every prison she could, documenting the unhygienic and unregulated conditions. Treatment of the mentally ill ranged from drilling holes in their head to strapping them to a chair and keeping them in a dark room for several hours on end. From there, Dix petitioned the Massachusetts legislature, demanding reform for the imprisoned and mentally ill. Massachusetts then agreed to the funding of prisons and asylums. Dix continued to tour the U.S., demanding a change. Alongside Dix's reforms, the Auburn prison system was taking over the United States by storm. Such a system was based on silence, corporal punishment, and group labor. Auburn State Prison, built in New York, was a model prison, offering a place for criminals to cultivate penitence. Hence the name, penitentiary. Now onto the subject of education. As of 1830, there was no such state that had a universal public education system paid by taxes, but interest in such education was growing rapidly. Before any reforms to education were made, only the rich could afford to send their kids to private schools or hire private tutors, and some kids working on farms only attended school a few times a year. How awesome would that be? Horace Mann became the first secretary of the Massachusetts Board of Education and greatest educational reformer in 1837. Some of his achievements included lengthening the school year to 6 months, doubling teacher salaries, enriching the curriculum, and professional training for teachers. By the 1850s, tax-supported elementary schools popped up and were supported by every state in America. In addition, education for immigrants and Native Americans were high in demand, for many people felt that an American education would help Americanize such people. Changes in higher education occurred as well. The number of colleges increased, alongside the number of education-designated public land grants. Such colleges included Stanford and Vanderbilt. This also sparked the creation of colleges to help out the handicapped, such as the Perkins School for the Blind in Boston and Thomas Gallaudet's creation of a school for the deaf, both being the first of their kind.
Thank you, Casey Green. This is Emily Green reporting to you from Feminism in the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. The first gathering devoted to women's rights in the United States was held July 19, 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York. The principal organizers of the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848 was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a mother of 4 from upstate New York, and the Quaker abolitionist movement Lucretia Mott. About 100 people attended the convention, and 2/3 of it consisted of women. Stanton drafted a Declaration of Sentiments, grievances, and resolutions that echoed the preamble of the Declaration of Independence. We hold this truth to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal. Among the 13 resolutions set forth in Stanton's declaration was the goal of achieving the sacred right of franchise. Initially, women reformers addressed social and institutional barriers that limited women's rights, including family responsibilities, a lack of educational and economic opportunities, and the absence of voice in political debates. Stanton and Susan B. Anthony met in Seneca Falls in 1850 and forged a lifetime alliance as women's rights activists. For much of the 1850s, they agitated against the denial of basic economic freedoms to women. Later, they unsuccessfully lobbied Congress to include women in the provisions of the 14th and 15th Amendments. In the wake of the Civil War, however, reformers sought to avoid marginalization as social issues, zealots by focusing their message exclusively on the right to vote. In 1869, two distinct factions of the suffrage movement emerged. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Anthony created the National Women's Suffrage Association, which directed its efforts towards changing federal law and opposed the 15th Amendment because it excluded women. Stanton had taken the position as its president. Lucy Stone, a one-time Massachusetts anti-slavery advocate and prominent lobbyist for women's rights, formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. Leaders of the AWSA rejected the NWSA's agenda as being racially divisive and organized with aim to continue national reform effort at the state level. Although California Senator Aaron Sargent introduced in Congress a women's suffrage amendment in 1878, the overall campaign stalled. Eventually, the NWSA also shifted its efforts to the individual states where reformers hoped to start a ripple effect to win voting rights at the federal level. Finally, on June 4, 1999, the 19th Amendment had been passed. This had guaranteed women the right to vote, which was a breakthrough for women's suffrage. This victory took decades of agitation and oppression. Beginning in the mid-19th century, several generations of women's suffrage supported, lectured, marched, lobbied, and practiced civil disobedience to achieve what many Americans considered a radical change in the Constitution. Few early supporters lived to see the final victory in 1920 when it was ratified. This is Emily Green signing off.
This is Skylar Green. In the beginning, anti-slavery ideals were subtle. The American Colonization Society, organized in Virginia in 1817, was against slavery without challenging Southern property rights. The society wanted to free slaves gradually, and then they wanted to compensate the slave owners with money from the legislature or other private charities. They wanted to send the newly freed slaves back to Africa and made the arrangements to do so, but they couldn't because there wasn't enough funding. Also, many of the African Americans were too many generations away from being African to really want to go back home. It took 10 years for the American Colonization Society to transfer the same amount of blacks as those born in the United States in 1 month. As you can see, it didn't really help to end slavery. The anti-slavery movement lost support until the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded by William Lloyd Garrison in 1832. Garrison was extremely radical and he wanted immediate change. He really looked at the damaging effects that slavery had on the actual slaves rather than just white society. This was revolutionary for the time. By 1838, Garrison had 250,000 friends that believed in his new bold attitude that didn't include violence. The society was important for spreading this new pure anti-slavery movement. With this new attitude on anti-slavery, abolitionism came into play. An abolitionist is someone who favors the termination of a practice or institution, and in this case it's slavery. In the 1830s, this movement called a lot of attention, and there was also a divide. There were moderates and there were extremists. Some people were moderates and others were extreme and wanted immediate anticipation completely and as soon as possible. Moderates believed in appealing to the consciences of the slave owners. They thought that if they told the slave owners that what they were doing was a sin and was morally wrong, that the slave owners would totally abolish slavery and wouldn't want their slaves anymore. Of course, this didn't work out. At the same time, the abolitionists in the North totally dogged the South for wanting slavery, but in the North, black people that were free still didn't have good jobs, good education, or any kind of voting rights. Hypocrites! The idea of free soil killed two political birds with one stone. The people who wanted to abolish slavery got slavery removed from their territory, and the people who just wanted their land to be completely white without any black people got the slaves removed too. This means it was great for racists and non-racists alike. Some white people felt strongly about abolitionism, but many abolitionists were black. Black abolitionists were usually freed slaves that understood the hardships of slavery, but now gained the freedom and rights to say something about it. Some, like David Walker, believed that violence was the only way to solve these problems. He thought that slaves should go as far as killing their masters in order to get true freedom. Others were more moderate, or at least less violent. Frederick Douglass used his words to eloquently describe the hardships of slavery, as well as his own personal experiences of being a slave. Although I've said a lot about these abolitionists, there was definitely a counter-argument coming from anti-abolitionists at the time. And they didn't always use words to describe their thoughts and emotions. Anti-abolitionists were increasingly violent against the abolitionist minority during the 1830s. They were afraid it would produce a war between the groups and that the blacks would flee to the north, both of which occurred. They were also afraid of the change and instability it could bring to a nation now just coming together. Because of this, anti-abolitionists were violent against the message of abolitionism. In 1834, they burned down the Temple of Liberty, which was the headquarters of abolitionism located in Philadelphia. This act was just the beginning of many more riots to come. Skylar Green, signing off.